Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this. I think it's one of the last sessions. My name is Jacek Smolicki. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Linköping University in Sweden, currently pursuing a 3-year international postdoc that allows me to travel. So basically, Swedish taxpayers are paying to keep me away from Sweden for 3 years. And I'm, of course, happy about it because I had this amazing chance to meet you and hang out with you and work with you. And during my research, I was affiliated as a guest researcher at Simon Fraser University and currently also at Harvard, which is also partly supported by Fulbright Commission. The entire project is supported by the Swedish Research Council. And my project evolves in kind of through a threefold architecture, through case studies or projects, kind of artistic projects, you might call them, Soundwalk compositions, through a festival that I've co-founded with Tim Shaw in, should I be admitting people or, because there are people showing up on, okay, sure. Okay. So yes, so the second way of pursuing my research is through a festival that I co-founded in 2019 with Tim Shaw, a British sound artist, and we are trying to create a community of soundwalking artists by establishing a platform for them to share their work. And we so far organized 6 editions, actually 3 editions that happen simultaneously in 2 cities each time. That's the idea, to bring 2 cities, connect them and see what will emerge from that. And the third kind of path in my research is, of course, through publications. Working through publications. This is the recent book that you might have already seen displayed here, Soundwalking Through Time, Space and Technologies, where I was lucky enough to collaborate with brilliant school or flock or whatever you call them of scholars from many different backgrounds and many different paths of lives. And among them was Amanda, who's here with us, and Milena Drumeva, who's also part of this conference. And initially I was planning to talk more about the book, but I was given a chance to present it in the form of a soundscape composition that will include the voices of some of the contributors, and that will happen with the concert after our session. So I already welcome you to that. So soundwalking doesn't need introduction in this context, obviously, and today it's a widespread concept and practice that has been adopted across many context fields, disciplines, and communities. As John Drover suggests, the richness of context in which it is being adopted proves that it's increasingly emergent rather than a transplantable fixed practice. So, of course, in the most popular iteration, we are invited to walk in a group while remaining silent. We are alone and together at the same time. And such soundwalks are performed with a goal to achieve a certain state of immersion in the current moment. Many of us would probably agree that that's the actual, the main point of soundwalking, to reconnect with the kind of immediacy of the environment that oftentimes on a kind of common basis we don't pay enough attention to. But in my approach, soundscapes that we walk through and which in turn walk through us are not merely emanations of the present moment. Instead, I perceive the present moment, the here and now, as a complex composition that spans the elements of pasts and futures, even deep pasts and deep futures. So by implication, soundwalking establishes gateways, and crossing them is, again, not about entering in a kind of seamless state of immersion, an innocent state of being one with environment, but I would say rather immersion, or a temporary state of being evacuated from the world as we know it, lifted up from certainties, habits, conventions, biases, preconceptions, in order to make us see and hear them more sharply. A geographer and sound artist, Anne Kangiser, suggests that sound is not just about hearing and responding or communicating. It's about becoming aware of registers that are unfamiliar, inaccessible, and maybe even monstrous. Registers that are wholly indifferent to the play of human drama. My intention while working with soundwalking, approaching soundwalking, is not to kind of radically destabilize the listener's position or the human position on the planet. We cannot escape human centeredness, but it's rather to aid us in differently positioning ourselves within the complex interplay of different scales, agencies, and temporalities. And here, my thoughts are in line with Hildegard Westerkamp, and her practice of disruptive listening, which is about opening our oral perception to the unexpected, even undesired and unwanted feelings, making us find ourselves in a state of uneasiness. And it is, I believe, in this state of uneasiness where the transformative potential of soundwalking can be realized. And one way of facilitating that state of uneasiness in my work is through creating conditions for what I like to call transversal listening. And in mathematics, as you know, the transversal line cuts across two or more parallel lines, not straight, but at a certain angle. And similarly, transversal listening, I suggest, cuts across multiple layers of our immediate reality. And the angle of that cut indicates the listening's capacity to operate across time as well. So once one layer's particular resonance today is partially an effect of past activities that took place within another stratum, another layer. During his keynote, David Haskell spoke about soundscapes being temporary gatherings of sounds of diverse causalities, a beautiful, in my opinion, way of really getting to the point of what soundscapes are. And transversal listening to soundscapes is an encounter in and with that knot, that kind of congregation of vibrational forces, of which ephemeral tentacles span multiple temporal, spatial, and agential realms, some of which normally, on our kind of everyday basis, often remain far beyond our sensory and cognitive reach. And my use of the term transversal or transversality is nothing new. Of course, there's been a lot done about that when it comes to philosophy of technology, cultural studies, and so on. And I think particularly relevant here is the work of Kangiser again, who has explored transversality in relation to sound. And drawing on Guattari, Kangiser described transversality or geotransversality as a technique for mapping out an assemblage of vulnerabilities, bodies and forms of life vulnerable to sonic governance. It's a technique of attunement with formations of human and other than human subjects, objects, and infrastructures in specific geopolitical contexts constructed and maintained through practices of, for example, colonization and militarization. And in my approach to transversal listening, I'm very close to that way of thinking about transversality, but I'm also interested in exploring how such alertness, such kind of transversal alertness to the space around us can eventually be cultivated daily in one's locally situated environment. So how can we walk and listen critically and reflectively, also beyond the aesthetic framework of a soundwalk? How can we do as opposed to perform soundwalking? I think that's the ultimate goal of us soundwalkers. At least that's my hope, that's the goal. So how can soundwalking become a mode of resistance to hegemonic forms of attentional fixity, and instead a persistent practice of something I call kind of, weirdly coexistential trans-individuation, also drawing on Bernard Stiegler's term and Simon Don, which is to say a practice of seeing, hearing, or perhaps altogether sensing one's self and one's agency as only one among multiple others within a much larger, longer, and open-ended composition of tendencies, relations, and interdependencies. In my attempts to figure out what this transversal listening could be, I found helping hand, as many of us, I noticed during this conference, in Dylan Robinson's proposition of approaching listening as a practice of oscillation. It's a form of moving between layers of positionality that seeks not to apply other critical listening positionalities, which is a violent act, can be a violent act, but instead to find greater levels of relationship between the strata of positionality. Now, by working with the notion of soundwalk composition as opposed to soundwalking, this is my way of differentiating my work from, kind of more commonly perceived practice of soundwalking. I acknowledge that sounds are always already compositions that span different timescapes, positions, and scales. And consequently, through my work, I have learned that any kind of recording, any kind of act of listening, or any kind of recording is always already field recording or field listening. When we record sound, we enter and intervene into a field of relations expressed in and through sound. And also when we play the recording, we make it enter another field of relations. And this is something we, I think, touched upon during the kind of pre-conference panel, that it's not only about questioning the act of pressing the record button, but it's also about questioning the act of pressing the play button afterwards. So to practically facilitate this movement or this oscillation between positions and scales, I draw on diverse forms of mediating sound as we walk in a group within the kind of boundaries established by that very act of walking in place. And this include real-time transmission, unmediated listening to the immediate surroundings, composing with and creating room for field recordings and archival material as well that is connected or rooted in the place that we walk through. And I'll just now jump into a first case I've developed within my work, which I'm now revisiting because my postdoctoral research is getting to a conclusion. And I will try to kind of use that case to talk a little bit more about some of those concepts in a more practical sense. So in 2020, I moved to Vancouver to begin my international postdoc at the invitation of Professor Barry Truax at Simon Fraser University. And of course, 2-3 weeks after I arrived, the pandemic happened, and I was kind of not allowed to hang out at the campus. My intention was to spend some time with the archive, the World Soundscape Project archive, but instead I was forced to be wild in the field, which I didn't mind at all. And so I focused on exploring the vicinity of place I was lucky to live in, downtown Vancouver, and I focused on intertidal zones within the vicinity of my place. These are prime kind of examples of ecotones, which, as we know, are zones where several diverse ecosystems coexist, interact, or compete, but which are also very vulnerable due to climate change. So one day, while walking on an extra strip of land revealed by low tide, I stopped and dipped my hydrophones in one of the tidal pools left behind by the withdrawing water. I used my recording gear primarily to amplify my sonic witnessing of the events unfolding in the pool. And I'm here with Matthew Bartner, who pursues very interesting critique of audio recording equipment, suggesting that sample that the recorder generates while separating the sound from the experience creates the false impression that the most important sonic aspect of the field recording adventure is contained in the audio sample. The end of quote. So after a few minutes of silence, I began to hear a delicate rustle. And this recording is made later after that act of kind of just you're witnessing the tidal pool. And let me play just a short excerpt. So what I was ear witnessing without seeing it was a limpet rhythmically scraping off the overgrowth of the algae on the tidal rocks. And limpets, as you know, are those extremely interesting small aquatic snails characterized by a conical shell and a strong muscular foot, which allows them to adhere to the surface of rock and withstand the force of oceanic waves. They evolved, I think, around 500 million years ago in Cambrian era. I bet David would have something more to say about that. So they're often described as maintainers or gardeners or engineers of tidal pools. And this is because they systematically clean rock surfaces, enabling inhabitation by other species, such as barnacles, mussels, and clams. And because of their cleaning function, they are extremely important in cultivating the ecosystemic balance in those zones. And to scrape off the algae, limpets use a set of extremely strong teeth, bristled along their tongue, known as radula. And what makes their teeth particularly strong are those distinctive composite nanostructures consisting of high volumes of goethite nanofibers, which are considered the strongest material on our planet. So besides helping them effectively scrape off the algae, it's also a kind of a tool for them that allows them to mechanically kind of traverse intertidal zones. And goethite was named after Johann von Goethe, who, as you know, besides being a literary figure, was also deeply committed to observation-based studies of rocks and minerals. And those observations helped him to contribute to both sciences and arts with the concept of primal phenomenon, And with this concept, he argued that there exists a key phenomenon to which all associated effects can be attributed. And recently, Goethe's theories has been actually applied in marine biology, including studies of intertidal zones. Organisms that occupy them, including limpets, can be interpreted as organic manifestations of constraints and affordances generated by tidal variations, an instance of Goethe's primal phenomenon. So from this perspective, what I witnessed in the tidal pool and hoped to invite others to do so through a Soundwalk later on was not just a sonic emanation of the limpet's dining routine. Rather, that event or the pool in which it took place was a microcosm of resounding rhythms and forces whose origins reach far beyond our planetary scope and familiar temporal frameworks. However, upon my following visits to the tidal zone, this time during high tide, my hydrophones revealed a completely different kind of soundscape, an immense linear hum coming from the propellers of vessels and crude oil tankers stationed at the bay. In that hum, I heard a completely different type of macrocosm, one that comprised a mesh of global noises, echoing colonial activities which more than 150 years ago began to violate and erase cyclical rhythms of human and other than humans, replacing them with the regime of a mechanical clock. And that observation inspired me to keep seeking such connections between other kind of immediate, often inconspicuous or maybe barely audible sounds, something we already refer to as infraordinary sounds perhaps, and connect them to more macroscopic events in the past, also the kind of deep geological part at the time. This is where I started working with the concept of dialectical sounds. And if you're familiar with Walter Benjamin and his notion of dialectical images, which basically tells us that images speak or begin to speak to us truly through relations that they form against each other or when set against each other. In the similar way, sounds reveal something important, especially when set in relation to each other. I like to say that sounds speak through relations that they form about the relations that form them. So an array of observations of that kind captured through field notes, field recordings, and through historical research alongside conversations with scientists, sound researchers, and members of First Nations communities, especially the Squamish community, eventually led to a script for the final Soundwalk composition, an hour-long audio piece I composed to be listened to while walking along a specific patch of the intertidal zone, revealed during low tide. And here I just list a couple of those instances where I connect, for instance, the activities of metal detectorists who come during the low tide to search for, treasure, to the kind of activities of settlers coming to continue the kind of the gold rush to what they were calling the New El Dorado, and which is now British Columbia. Or similarly, I make a connection between those beached logs that arrive often during the high tides and remain during the low tides on the beaches with the extractivist logging industry that still continues in BC today. So in the narrative of the Soundwalk, the main protagonist gradually transforms from a human to a no longer definable element of a larger environment. And in that process, it simultaneously undergoes displacement, de-identification, and yet grounding. In that process, we are witnessing a metamorphosis. The protagonist's growing openness to an acceptance of sonic registers, normally inaccessible, does something that causes that metamorphosis. So the skill to listen from multiple perspectives, to oscillate between them, and echolocate, by which I also mean to recognize the echoes of the past in present soundscapes, becomes at once a poison and remedy, a form of liberation and torture. This is because obtaining wider access to those previously untapped sonic registers entails becoming exposed to a range of troubling noises, realizations, traumas, and confusions. In that processes, I like to say, the most familiar sound marks become sound wounds or sound scars. So I won't tell you how the story ends. It's certainly a bit more hopeful than that. And the reason why I want to tell you is because with this piece, I'm particularly careful about keeping it bound to the specific site and also the time specificity or the timescape of the site. The piece was live streamed from a specially designed website only during the periods of low tide in September 2020. And in order to experience it, listeners had to come to the specific location indicated on the accompanying map with their mobile phones and headphones. And here are some images from the premiere, and this is the website where the live stream was synchronized with the times of the low tide in Vancouver. I think we're probably there with time, right? So I will just finish here, and I will maybe play one more sound, which has to do with the sounds of the logs. And you are welcome to ask questions already now. We can keep it in the And in this particular moment of the sound, what you hear is the hydrophonic recordings of the logs recorded in some of those booms. There are structures that are lots of quiet compound with the kind of estuary. And you also hear archival materials from the World Soundscape Project archive that basically represent the noises of lumber mills, which are located. And also that part of the Soundwalk is also accompanied by a narrative from Kansas Sample, who represents this talking about the spiritual dimensions of living with the trees, which again creates a situation once you're there and then encounter the situation described by some of the great. Sorry, I can just go on forever, but I think we're done. Thank you so much for your attention.
I was wondering if you did research in the World Soundscape Project, and also seeing it in the framework of what are you right now considering in the framework of by the time when it was born, we have a lot of that transition
Right.
What are the questions about also in relation to
yeah. Thank you, Amanda. Maybe I'll repeat to the Zoom participants. What are your reflections about dealing with the World Soundscape Project archive, and are those kinds of positions and issues there, or have there been there as the project was commenced, right? I don't think they were there, those considerations, and one reason, I guess, also, through the discussions with the members, is basically that the debate wasn't going on at the time, right? So it didn't seem like there was enough of a stimulation to include those kinds of perspectives in a way. And I mean that's the biggest criticism that World Soundscape Project receives, right? The omission of the other than kind of white Western perspective on the soundscapes, and also picking a certain historical moment as the beginning point from which we should be concerned about soundscapes, right? Which is the industrialization and mechanization of human activities and so on. And that's why I really value that David's kind of shift and inclusion of also deep time, like trying to maybe establish new points of reference for the acoustic ecology, because I feel like we got stuck in those departure points that Schaefer and his crew were setting 50 years ago. So, but saying that, I need to say that there's a willingness to start revising the archive and opening it up to those other positions and those other perspectives. And I was humbled to be invited also to contribute with an archive of soundscapes, soundscape recordings I did when I was there in 2020, which kind of coincided with the 50th anniversary of the first documentation of Vancouver soundscapes. And I was trying to make sure to kind of include in the most ethical way, you know, those sounds that haven't been there, and I felt need to be there, you know, including those positionalities that, you know, have been historically excluded. So there is definitely a will, there is definitely an interest to keep revising it, and I think that's what, you know, makes this project still relevant and worth pursuing. Thank you, man. Yeah.
Especially when you think about framing sound recording as a writing act rather than capture. Do you find that fits your work? And if so, can it be extended to framing Soundwalking as sort of writing act rather than, for example, performing?
I really like that question, and I definitely resonate with it. And when I teach field recording, I think I mentioned it to some of you already. I often say that please start with no field recording equipment and try to record the field through other means and, or, you know, other ways. And the same when it comes to articulating soundscapes. We don't need to just play them through speakers. We can articulate them in so many different ways and kind of move away from that kind of capture culture, you know, and this kind of immediacy that and effortlessness. I think is a little bit problematic in that act, because I think it makes us skip a lot of questions that we should be asking. And if you engage, for instance, with, you know, re-articulating soundscapes through creating kind of, you know, I don't know, like trying to re-articulate the sounds by building little sculptures, for instance, you are given automatically that extra time to reflect and to, you know, pose some critical questions, for instance. So that's what I've been trying to inspire. And I think writing is one of these kind of more lengthy and, you know, slower modes that can, you know, open up many more questions that sometimes the kind of automated way of working with field recordings. And so yes, I'm definitely with, I don't know who asked that question. Mike. Thank you, Mike. Yes, the Soundwalk composition is limited to the place, and in the case of this intertidal room, also to a specific time. And this is where kind of my interest in not only site specificity, but also time specificity, I think, emerged. We do a lot of field recordings at not only in specific places, but also during specific moments, specific, you know, time periods. And we tend to sometimes forget about that, right? What would it mean to give justice to the time specificity of a field recording? If for the site specificity, giving justice might mean working just in that space, for instance. For time specificity, it could mean, for instance, working during just that particular moment, you know, a period of time, letting it go a little bit, you know, also embrace the kind of ephemerality that David was talking about. So yes, soundwalking compositions, in my perspective, are kind of bound to places, although they speak of places sometimes, you know, really, really distant. But still kind of resonant historically with the place that we find ourselves in. Thank you.